Good evening,
Yeah, good
Chris.
evening.
Well, Chris, I have good news. Since the last time we met, obviously Israel has opened to tourists, and I have now found, as Joy Travel, what I deem as sufficient travel insurance that will cover risks relating to COVID and travel. So, hot off the press, but we are going to be starting our trips from end of March next year, and we're going to start advertising quite soon.
Wonderful news. Wow, that is fantastic. It's good news, and it'll be wonderful to be able to absent you because you're in Israel. So that'll be something special to possibly have you reporting and joining us from Israel for the webinars.
Chris, that will be amazing.
Jackie, isn't it wonderful? I was just thinking today, we stand on the shoulders of some amazing Christians when it comes to Israel. People who didn't see the evidence of what we see, people going back centuries who read the scriptures and prayed those scriptures, some of whom were praying those scriptures, which constituted the prophetic return of the Jewish people when the Jewish people were still being scattered. They prayed them through the Holocaust, knowing the horrors that were being poured out upon the Jewish people. And yet they held fast to the promises of scripture. And here we are today talking about Israel. So I want to just acknowledge those people that have gone before us, who stood upon God's word and prayed Israel into being. You've probably visited the Friends of Zion Museum in Jerusalem, which is exactly that. It's a tribute to people who played a role down through maybe not the ancient history, but more recent history. People who were strategically positioned, spoke out for Israel, were role players. And of course, one of the most stunning things about the Friends of Zion Museum is they have all these pictures up. And when you enter the museum, you go through a little routine of having your picture taken, and they very kindly give you a fridge magnet with your face on it. But then as you're in the closing scenes of this very high-tech museum, amongst all the heroes of Zion, you find your own picture floating around there. So it's a very special experience, excellent museum.
It really is, Chris, and I can see that you and I are on the same wavelength tonight, because when you were speaking about standing on the shoulders of those who've gone before us, I immediately went back to those beautiful presentations that one sees at that museum. And one thing that really strikes me when you go there and you see the pictures of Israel before the Jewish people returned, and the land was barren, it was desolate. There was literally nothing there. There was not a single building. There was nothing. And to think what this country has been established as by the hard work of the Jewish diaspora is quite incredible over a very short period of time, all things considered. I think it's probably about 73 or 74 years now. It's quite amazing, Chris.
It certainly is.
Tonight's topic, I can't wait for us to get into it. So tonight's discussion, Chris, is one that is of incredible relevance, because given the nature of the media and the reporting, we are always led to believe that the situation between Israel and Palestine is a stalemate that really cannot be resolved, and the only way that there can be peace in the Middle East is for Israel to give up a significant portion of its land, and specifically to cede certain important biblical sites, including Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, for example, into Palestinian control and authority. So given all of that, I think that many Christians are not too sure what they think about the political situation. Do you as a Christian, should you support a two-state solution? Is that a good thing? Is it possible for there to be peace in the Middle East? So, Chris, these are some of the questions that I know our folks at home are going to be wondering. So I have literally said my say. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. I agree with you. This is a very important topic. It is the whole dynamic around the two people that really lay claim to the same piece of land. And it's important for us to understand something of the history. And ultimately, as I close, I will just remind us again of some of the scriptures. So we've pitched this as a chess match. And that's really, in many ways, it's an apt description, because it is a very slow, drawn-out process. And really, in times of history, we've seen some significant progress, but in recent times, there's been very little happening. And I want to start by quoting out of an interview, in fact, with the author of a book called Chosen Peoples, Sacred Sources, National Identity. And in this, David Smith says, concerning the Jewish people and the Palestinians, both people have a sense of the sacredness of their role in the moral economy of the world. Speaking about Israel, he says the following: the deep tradition of chosenness, of being set apart, of being elected to do God's will, or at any rate to have a separate course in history, remains a powerful cement for modern Israel. A great deal of the public ceremony and ritual of the underlying day-to-day assumptions about the place of the Jews in history and the place of Israel in Jewish history and the world is based upon this idea. And it is united, and of course, this is the key factor, with the belief that is only in Israel that this destiny can be worked out. So that would ring true for most people, knowing about the nation of Israel, knowing our Bibles, and recognizing that here is a nation that is set apart in the community of nations. I don't think anybody disputes that looking back historically, but within the church, there's a debate about this as to whether modern Israel still has a role to play. And that'll be the topic of a separate webinar when we talk about that. What about the Palestinians? The Palestinians are underpinned by Islam, a world religion, and the Arabs, who are the leaders of the Islamic world in terms of the historic nature of their role as the bearers of the creed of Islam to other countries, and because the Quran is written in Arabic. This sense of chosenness and of covenant with God, with Allah, underpins the beliefs of the Arabs, including the Palestinians, in their claim to retake the land, which is now Israel, and make it part of the Arab Islamic domain. So in these two statements, I believe we see really the makings of an agenda that is seldom spoken of in the negotiations, but of course weighs heavily on both sides of this discussion, weighs heavily on the Palestinian people and weighs heavily on the Jewish people. Let me show you this in action through the Ayatollah Khomeini, the spiritual leader, the ultimate leader of the state of Iran. And in 27, he said the following: according to Islamic jurisprudence, when an enemy takes over Muslim lands, jihad, holy war, in any possible form becomes everyone's duty. Today, the fight against the Zionist regime is obligatory and necessary for Muslims. Why do some evade this duty? So one has to appreciate in that statement, from probably within the Shiite world, the most significant and important cleric, a statement which looks at Israel and says, from an Islamic perspective, there's no legitimacy for the Zionist or the Jewish people to rule on the land which we today know as Israel. So I want to, before we get into something of the detail of the Palestinian stroke Israel journey to where we are, I want to just give a little bit of insight as this nation, or the United Nations, was preparing to vote Israel and a future Arab state into being. So on the Jewish side of this equation, we find a very concerted, a very coordinated, a very well-organized process which starts in 1897, where the first Jewish Congress was held. Theodor Herzl was the visionary behind it, and that set in motion a process which ultimately we saw leading to the establishment of Israel. The Jewish people, because of their cohesiveness, being a body of people that is held together at least within the synagogue wherever they are, they formed a strong lobby wherever they were, and specifically in the United Kingdom and in America, where it was a very important part of this process. The Jewish people had a very strong sense of identity. We are the Jewish people. They had a strong sense of connectedness to a particular geographic location on the globe, and they were organized. And in Palestine, as it was referred to at those days, they were organized and they had an ever-increasing footprint on the ground there. To a degree, they were driven by need, because persecution, as it had haunted them for the previous 2,000 years, continued to haunt them wherever they found themselves. Ultimately, we know that it was in Europe that they were slaughtered, some 6 million of them. They set about in Israel, in the area known as Palestinian Mandate, set about creating pre-state institutions. The other day we mentioned some of the institutions, the educational institutions, Haifa Technion, the Hebrew University. Those were created pre-state. And of course, they also had significant leaders that they looked up to. Chaim Weizmann, Theodor Herzl, David Ben-Gurion. So there were a number of significant leaders, and furthermore, they were democratically minded. The whole establishment of the kibbutz movement was a highly democratic, although it was a socialist system, everybody who was a part of the kibbutz had an equal vote in the kibbutz. If we then go over to the side of the Palestinian Arabs, they pretty much had none of that. And one of the reasons for that is that they were just citizens in the center of this vast Ottoman Empire. So they had no sort of clear identity other than being in a geographical area. If they had an identity, they related to Syria, that sort of umbrella of control within this Ottoman Empire. It was really the arrival of the Jewish people and their establishment of the kibbutzes and their ever-increasing arrival and their momentum that they created, which started to ignite within the Arab Palestinians a sense of national aspiration. We also want to be a people. We also want to have a destiny as a nation. They had no leadership structures. Part of that was the fact that there'd never been a really great need for that. But also during the British Mandate period, the British sort of meddled with their ability to create clear structures. So they had some political structures, but nothing which could speak on behalf of the nation. And in fact, going forward, that would continue to dog them right up until today. Massive internal divisions within the world, and they were poorly organized. So as we look at this runway ahead of us, and we think back to 1947 with the vote in the United Nations to create a future Jewish and a future Arab state, we recognize here that one side of that equation, the Jewish side, is well equipped to fly their plane, run down the runway and take off. And as we heard Jackie say in the lead into it, what an incredible achievement this country has had in the last 73 years. A young country that started from a dust bowl has developed in one of the most modern and competitive countries on the globe. So the United Nations votes, and it envisions a future Jewish state and a future Arab state. If you look at the map, the white portion on the map is going to be the future Jewish state according to the partition plan, which they've identified. And then the orangey color will be the future Arab state. One sort of anomaly in the midst of it, and that is they could not resolve the issue of Jerusalem. And you will see below Jerusalem, it was created or decided that it would be an international zone controlled by neither, but administered internationally on behalf of both people. So if we look at the diagram, the future Jewish state, who was living there? Jewish citizens of British Mandate Palestine, so they were living there. Then within the same boundaries, even within the partition, there were Arab citizens living in that area. And in a similar fashion, the future Jewish state was predominantly Arab citizens, but also within that area, there were Jewish citizens living in the area which was determined to be the future Arab state. So naturally, every one of these people had an interest in what lay ahead. But that was not the only interest in this decision. On the Jewish side, the entire Jewish diaspora, every Jewish person living outside the state of Israel was looking at the unfolding drama there and was vitally interested in what was happening there, including about 1 million Jews that were living across North Africa and out to the Middle East, living under Arab/Islamic rule. And although they'd lived there, some of them for over 2,000 years, their situation with the mooted future Jewish state coming into being had become very insecure. On the Arab side, future Arab state side, the entire Muslim world was looking on. Why? Because they saw that land as Muslim land. It had been conquered in the early conquests in the 7th century. It had been been conquered. And in Islamic theology, once land is conquered, it becomes part of the Ummah, the land which is the possession of Islam. So the entire Muslim world is looking on. Israel declares its independence in May 1948 and is immediately invaded by several armies coming in to wipe this just newly birthed Jewish state off the map. But of course, that didn't happen. Tenacious fighting. The Jewish people, recognizing that if they lost that war, they would lose everything, fought and ultimately persevered in that war. And if you look to the map on the right-hand side and compare the two maps, there are a number of significant things that happened in that war. Number one is that two pieces of land, which had been intended for the future Arab state, had been annexed by neighboring countries. The area we know as the Gaza Strip was annexed by Egypt in the conflict, and the area known later on as the West Bank, but known in those days biblically as Judea and Samaria, that was annexed by Jordan. And that was the end, as it were, from their perspective, of this future Arab state. However, in the conflict, you can see Israel also conquered more land. Right up in the north of the country, there was a major swath of land that would have been part of the future Arab state. That was conquered and became part of Israel. And you can see the shape and the map changes significantly. So that's what we're looking at there is, as you will see in the heading, the 1948 War of Independence, impact on the land. But what was the impact on the Jews in this war? What happened to the Jewish people? So if we look at the left of the diagram, you see the state of Israel now. First block is Jewish Israelis who are living in that newly declared state. So nothing changed for them other than them gaining the autonomy of being in a state of their own. But in the conflict, Jewish refugees arrived in the newly founded state of Israel from two locations. One was from within, because Jewish people found it unsafe for them to live in the areas which were controlled by Jordan. Jordan, it actually was established to have no Jews living in it. And that was applied to the area that was conquered in 1948 as well. So there were Jews that had to flee internally into what I would determine as Israel proper. But then things turned very ugly for the Jewish people living across North Africa, some million of them living under Arab/Islamic rule. Those countries, one after the other, turned on those Jewish people, and they literally, in a few years, the greatest part of their population fled out of those regions. That turned into some 650,000 refugees out of those countries, most of whom came into Israel. Well, 650,000 came into Israel. So if we look at the map of North Africa, Morocco is a good example. Morocco's in the news at the moment because it signed peace treaties with Israel. Morocco was a vibrant community of Jewish people, a massive community. Some 250,000 Jews lived there in 1944. Today, a mere 3,000. If you look at other countries, Algeria had 140,000, absolutely no Jews living there today. And so it is, you can find your way through each of those countries there. What did they leave behind? They left behind homes, businesses, possessions, and unfortunately, whereas we hear a lot of rhetoric around the Palestinian refugees, there's been no international recognition or intervention on behalf of the million estimated Jews that fled the region. And they were well established in those countries. If we now look at the same concept, we're moving now from the impact on the Jews to the impact of the 1948-49 war on the Arabs, we see a number of things happening there. Number one, areas that were annexed by Jordan had Arabs living in them. So there were Arab residents living within what would become known as the West Bank. They became citizens of Jordan. But then also Arabs who were destined to be part of the future Israel felt insecure, and for a variety of reasons, one of which was the Arabs did not for a moment believe they would lose the war against Israel, and they encouraged the Arabs living in Israel to get out of the way because war is ugly, war is destructive, leave, exit the area, and you'll be able to come back in a week or two and reclaim your property and what is left of Jewish properties around you. Some fled because they feared retribution from the Jewish people because of earlier massacres that had happened against Jews at the hand of the Arabs. So some fled into what was part of Jordan, the so-called West Bank area, and some fled into Jordan proper. The area that was annexed by Egypt, the Gaza Arabs, they came under Egyptian control, but many of the refugees found refuge in Gaza. So they not only had the traditional residents of the Gaza Strip, many who fled out of the rest of Israel into there. And in a similar manner, Arabs crossed the border into Syria, into Lebanon, into Jordan. And the estimates are anything between 650,000 and 700,000 Arabs from Israel became refugees in the surrounding countries. So what happened to those people? The United Nations created a special agency called UNRWA, and they created refugee camps in the areas that are denoted there with a number inside a red circle. So for instance, in Lebanon, they established 12 camps, 19 camps established in what was then the West Bank of the Jordan River, in that area, 8 in the Gaza Strip, and 10 in the Jordan area. Those refugees, also by design of those countries, have kept those people living in refugee camps, and the UNRWA has continued to function in administering those people. And because of the strange way that UNRWA has been run, and refugees have been recognized in a unique manner in this case, those people that started out as about 650,000 today number some 5 million living across the region in 58 refugee camps, still today administered by UNRWA. So we get that impact on the Arabs. We now fast forward to 1967, 19 years, and Israel has faced several conflicts. And in 67, it is evident that Israel is about to have a massive onslaught from the surrounding Arab countries. They see the mobilization of forces, they hear the rhetoric in the media, and Israel miraculously does a preemptive strike, destroys the Egyptian and the Jordanian air forces on the ground, and a war which would have been massive ended in a mere 6 days, considered to be one of the greatest military campaigns in history. And out of that, Israel captured 4 pieces of land. Now, before I go into the detail of that land, Israel's reasoning when it captured that land was that this land offered them the bargaining chip that they had not had up to that point in their negotiation with the Arab world, represented by the Arab League. And Israel immediately made an offer to the Arab League, and they said, we will return land, but we seek peace, recognition, and negotiation. That was the Israeli offer, believing that they had within their means the way to be able to continue their existence in the Middle East without this antagonism and constant fight that they faced. The Arab League, a few months later, made this famous 3-no statement. There will be no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation. That was the Arab League response. And the consequence of that was that Israel was left with the land. So let's just do a walk through each of those pieces of land. They captured the Golan Heights from Syria. There's a good reason they did that. And that is that the Golan Heights lies on an escarpment overlooking the Sea of Galilee and many kibbutzes and small communities, a place like Tiberias across the lake. And the Syrians periodically would open fire on what was happening in the area below, and made it very difficult for Israel to have a comfortable existence on its own sovereign land in that area. And Israel decided that they would push the border back to create a buffer zone so that this could not happen from the Syrian point of view. It was annexed to Israel by an act of the Israeli parliament. And in fact, it was in the news in 2018 when the Trump administration acknowledged Israel's legitimate ownership of that land. The next piece of land that was captured was what had by that point become known as the West Bank. They captured this from Jordan. Where did the term West Bank come from? If you look at the map, the border between Jordan and Israel is the Jordan River. And while it was part of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, they would refer to it as Jordan on the west bank of the Jordan River. And ultimately, the nickname stuck, namely the West Bank. So that was captured from Jordan, and it remains today ultimately under Israeli army control, and its correct definition, it is disputed land. Next piece of land was that they captured the Gaza Strip from Egypt. Israel established communities there, some 23 Jewish communities were established in the Gaza Strip, and they flourished and actually brought a lot of prosperity to the Gaza Strip because they employed labor out of the Gaza citizens. However, in 2005, under the leadership of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, Israel withdrew the 8,000 Jewish people living in that area and handed control over to the Palestinian Authority that was the ruling entity over the Gaza Strip and over the so-called West Bank. Of course, that handover has been looked at as a major disaster because since then, Hamas has taken control over that area and has launched some 20,000 rockets over the last number of years into Israel from that land. It is a source of ongoing conflict. And lastly, and the largest piece of land, was Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. That was returned to Egypt in a historic 1979 peace agreement that Israel and Egypt signed, and that returned ownership of that land to Egypt. So in the 67 war, what was the impact of this war on people? So if we look at the section on the left, the state of Israel, you had the traditional Jewish Israelis that were under the control there. You had the Arabs that were citizens, full citizens of Israel that lived within the state of Israel. And now you had the addition of the Golan Heights. And interestingly, a major Druze community came under Israeli jurisdiction because they lived on the slopes of Mount Hermon. Coming under Israeli Defense Force control were the Arabs living in the so-called West Bank, including the refugees living in the refugee camps of the West Bank. In a similar manner, the Gaza Arabs and the refugees living in refugee camps in the Gaza came under Israeli Defense Force control. And then because this land that was captured, certainly the West Bank, was so significant biblically to the Jewish people and so significantly historically, this was the land where God had interacted with the patriarchs of Israel. This is the land where God said, I put my name for eternity. That included Jerusalem. It became the right thing for Jewish people to go and settle the land because after all, the Bible told them that this was their land. So you had a growing phenomena on this land of Jewish people going and creating communities there, some restoring communities that had been destroyed with massive loss of life in 1948 war. Places like Efrat in that area. In the surrounding Arab countries, you had refugees in Jordan, refugees in Syria, and refugees in Lebanon. We move forward to 1994 and the Oslo Peace Accords. This was brought about through a concerted effort within the international community and the realization within Israel that they would have to come to some form of accommodation with the Arabs that lived in the area that had been designated as the future Arab state. Those Arabs were living, many of them, in the refugee camps in the surrounding countries. Some of them were in exile because of their conflict with Israel, but also many of them were living within the two areas of Gaza and the West Bank. Out of these negotiations and the Oslo Accords, a shift in control started to take place. And when I say it started to take place, was because the intention was that process which started with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority was meant to be a journey on the way to full autonomy that was not described of the Palestinian people. Why did they need a journey? Because they didn't have the organs of state fully established, and there would be this transitional period where Israel would have ultimate control, but the Palestinians would set about creating the organs of state so that they could become a fully fledged country. So that was the impact on control. However, that has never progressed much beyond that point. There have been some adjustments to the border, etc., etc. But from that point onwards, although there have been several attempts, several Israeli offers to the Palestinian people, every one of those offers that has been made has not been met with a counter offer as one would do in negotiations, but by a blunt rejection on the part of the Palestinians. So let's have a look at the deadlock where it is today. What are the demands on each side? So number one is a return to the 1949 armistice lines. That's the demand of the Palestinians. That is pretty much the 67 borders. What is Israel's response to that? Israel's response to that is we cannot do that. We will look at 49 as a departure point, but over the years we have some 400,000 to 500,000 people who have started to live in these areas, citizens of Israel, and we cannot uproot so many people. We will have to redraw the border. And instead of sticking to the strict border, we will redraw the border and then we will give you land elsewhere in compensation. Palestinian demand is East Jerusalem as its capital. I've crossed out the East because that is a misleading concept. When you talk about East Jerusalem, friends, these are the places where you walk the streets of the Jewish community. It's where you go and pray at the Kotel. It's where you move around and spend a lot of your time in visiting Israel. That's East Jerusalem. But in essence, it's Jerusalem. The Israeli demand is we will not forgo access. There will be one Jerusalem and only one Jerusalem. In other words, we will not relinquish access to those parts of Jerusalem which are so rich in our history and rich in our prayers and rich in our future. The Palestinians demand full autonomy. The Israelis say we cannot allow that. It needs to be a demilitarized state. In other words, the Palestinians cannot have a fully fledged army because Israeli experience out of the Gaza experience is that that army will in time be used against the state of Israel. The Palestinian demands is the land that they will govern will have not a single Jew living on it. Every Jew will have to be removed. Israel's response to that is saying it's impractical to do that. We will give you land in exchange so that those Jewish communities can be connected to the future Israel, and we will swap land for you. Next demand is the return of Palestinian refugees to Israel. And I stress that this is to Israel. It's not to the future Arab state. So we're talking some potentially 5 million Palestinian refugees flooding into the Israel that you and I know today. And Israel says that would be demographic suicide for us at least, but practical suicide for us because many of those people would come in with the intention of destroying the Jewish state. Israel says we are prepared to consider compensation for those Palestinian refugees. And then the Palestinians says they don't need to recognize Israel as a legitimate state. And Israel says you have to utter the words, Israel is a legitimate state. So if we're talking and we want to represent the Palestinian plan, and especially the whole concept of the refugees, number one, on the map there, you see a picture and it shows arrows, and that's part of the demand of the Palestinians is that every Jew, every so-called settler living in that area has to leave that area. It needs to be free of all Jews. So we're talking about the state of Israel, which presently has Jewish Israelis of 5.7 million, starting to receive back into Jerusalem and into Judea and Samaria. The about 800,000 Jews living there would need to move and become part of Israel, resettled elsewhere in Israel. Included in the state of Israel at the present moment is 1.8 million Arab Israelis, citizens of the state of Israel. Then the green section are the refugees that must return to Israel and become citizens of the state of Israel. What would be left of Palestine or the future Palestinian state? In fact, it would be smaller in population numbers because its refugees, which are presently there, would go back to live in the future state of Israel. So the Palestinian plan, if we quantify it, the present situation is that Israel in total has 8.2 million citizens. The Jewish portion of that is 78%. The Arab portion is 22%. The future, if you were to implement the Palestinian plan, is that the Jewish portion would drop to 48%, and the combination of the traditional Arab citizens and the returning refugees would take that percentage up to 52%. That would be the end of Jewish rule, as it were, in Israel. Another reason for Israel's reluctance to move forward with this is the security situation. History has shown them, and bitter experiences taught them, that when they withdrew from the Gaza Strip, they were hit every year, sometimes multiple times a day, sometimes massive barrages of rockets being fired out of the Gaza Strip. But cumulatively, approaching 20,000 rockets and mortars have been fired into Israel from the Gaza Strip. So naturally, Israel is cautious about replicating that problem in what we would refer to as Judea and Samaria. And the reason for that is when you look at the map, you see that Israel at certain points between the Mediterranean Sea and Judea and Samaria, it's very narrow. In fact, it goes down to 13 kilometers. So somebody equipped with a fairly rudimentary weapon, occupying, as you can see from the relief map, the high ground, could bring Israel economically to a standstill, could close down Ben Gurion Airport. So Israel, from a military and a strategic point of view, is very reluctant to relinquish control over the West Bank totally into the hands of an enemy that at best is not considered to be trustworthy, but at worst, that area could be taken over by Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, all entities dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Let's get to the question, Israel and the Palestinians, stalemate or checkmate? So I want to suggest that we are dealing with a situation which I believe we could describe as a stalemate. I think as you've looked at those tables and recognized the aspirations of the Palestinians and the reluctance of Israel to give in to those demands, there is an element of stalemate there. But there's also an element of checkmate. And certainly what we've seen over the last number of months with the signing of the Abraham Accords is, whereas no country has been willing to even enter into discussions with Israel until the situation with the Palestinians has been resolved, the countries that have signed on with the Abraham Accords, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, have said we're going to put our own interests ahead of the Palestinians because we see that the Palestinians are purposely stopping the process from moving forward. So in a sense, from a Palestinian point of view, there's a very insecure situation which I traced in the leadership, and that remains an insecure leadership situation. If there was an election tomorrow, there is almost a guarantee that Mahmoud Abbas and the Fatah party would be defeated and Hamas would be the ruling authority over the West Bank, the future Palestinian state. And of course, that is neither desirable for the present establishment within Palestine or for the Israeli government. So I believe we have elements of both of these aspects in it. I also want to suggest that there is no real desire for the Palestinians to solve this in a way in which Israel would be able to continue as a functioning state alongside it, which incidentally is the position of the South African government, two states living side by side with security and with East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state. I believe that the Palestinians, if you review their educational systems, if you look at the media in the Palestinian side, there is no preparation of their nation to live at peace with Israel. On the contrary, there's a constant process of almost weaponizing young children and the adults of that community to dismiss the notion of Israel having a legitimacy there and creating a mindset that would go to war with Israel in a moment. All right. So just to conclude and to bring this back to a biblical perspective, what does God say about a two-state solution and the evacuation of Jewish people living in Israel? So firstly, there's quite a clear statement by God in Leviticus 25:23. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. You are strangers and sojourners with me. So Israel is not authorized by God. Obviously, the world could try and pressurize Israel to do it, but Israel is not authorized. It does not hold the title deeds. God holds the title deeds for this land. Secondly, God is a covenant-keeping God. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord lives, who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt, but the Lord lives, who brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north, and all the lands where he has driven them. For I will bring them back into their land, which I gave to their fathers. And finally, for all of those who would like to divide up Israel, this is an unfulfilled prophecy. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land. And God says to the nations, woe to those nations that would take a decision or add a momentum to the uprooting of my people Israel and their scattering amongst the nations and the division of the land.
Chris, so obviously that was quite a lot of information to take in. And on the one hand, I feel like we need to continue the discussion to recap what we've learned. But at the same time, I know it's quite overwhelming actually to process all of that. Though I must compliment you because your maps and your graphics really make it quite simple. There are a couple of questions that I would like to just pose to you quickly and, obviously get your feedback on. So the first question, Chris, is given in a sense the quite obvious stalemate and sort of realities of the complexities of what's going on in Israel, which seem obvious to those of us who can see it. What does the way forward look like? What do you think actually could be achieved as far as some kind of peace negotiation, the Abraham Accords? Can that bring any kind of peace or security to the area?
I think something like the Abraham Accords is doing something very important, and that is that it is establishing a vested interest in Israel's well-being that goes beyond just the benefit to America and obviously for Israel themselves. Because countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, even Sudan have in a sense now tied their destiny to Israel. They've certainly gone against the grain within the Arab stroke Islamic world by, as it were, reaching out to Israel. And they've done it in a way in which there's a warm friendship. So it's not as if they've done it just purely in a cold manner to get benefits out of it for themselves. The potential benefits for these countries is enormous economically because there's a very strong synergy between many of those countries. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain are superb businessmen. They have reach into all over the globe business-wise. And with the technology and the innovation of Israel matching with that, what it has done, in a sense, I think, for the Palestinians, it has probably, in my mind, although the rhetoric doesn't say that, for every Arab nation, and maybe Saudi Arabia will also come into this picture in a more tangible manner. Already there's a lot of interaction between Saudi Arabia and Israel. What it does is it's carrying a message to the Palestinians and saying to them, you are going to have to compromise, because that's been the stalling tactic, is they've been unwilling to compromise in any manner in their negotiations with Israel. But that said, I think I want to just remind us of where we started this journey in talking about, the calling of these two nations in their own perceptions. In other words, in a sense, the price for the Palestinians in their mind is not just a price for them as a people, it's a price for the Arab nations, and it's a price for Islam collectively. If you wind back the clock to the peace agreement, which I mentioned with Egypt. That peace agreement came at a price because Anwar Sadat broke ranks with the entire Arab world. They didn't forgive Egypt for decades, and he paid with his life. He was assassinated because he'd broken ranks and, as it were, gone against the tenets of Islam, which says that land has to be restored back to Islamic control.
I think, Chris, you actually encapsulated it quite well there, that fundamentally at its core, it's not actually about geography. There is a religious, there is a political, there is a historical mismatch in ideologies that really would be very difficult to find reconciliation between the two sides in terms of a compromise. And as you said, Israel is willing to give away certain portions of land and to compromise on certain things. But when you are sitting across the table with people who don't actually recognize your right to exist and want to see the annihilation of the Jewish state, you can't really negotiate with that. So again, I'm just reminded of the scripture that says we need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and pray for the people in that area. You touched on it briefly in your presentation, but I'd like to just unpack it a little bit. One of the biggest criticisms that we hear of organizations or spokespeople against Israel's right to the land is the fact that it was Palestine before it was called Palestine. The Arab people and the Palestinians were living there. So can you just unpack the true history of that name? And, you know, you alluded to it, obviously, in your presentation that there were Arab people living in the land prior and the British mandate, but maybe you can just remind the viewers at home, you know, why was it called Palestine and how do we reconcile that to Palestinians?
So that name was a creation of the Romans. So we're going back to that very turbulent period, the destruction of the temple leading on to the Bar Kokhba uprising, 66 AD and 134 AD. In that time, the Romans, because they realized that this bond between the Jewish people and Jerusalem and the land was so powerful, and that one uprising would only lead to another uprising because it was sort of a regenerating thing, that the bond was so powerful, that the Romans tried to do two things. They renamed Jerusalem, actually three things. They renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina. They renamed the area Palestina. And lastly, they forbade the Jewish people to even look upon the walls of Jerusalem. What were they trying to do? They were trying to break the connection of the Jewish people, the bond to Jerusalem and to this land. That clearly failed, but that is where the label Palestine as a regional name emerged for the first time. And through history, it has been regenerated. And significantly, when the British were given a mandate to rule over this part that remained out of the Ottoman Empire, they called that the Mandate for Palestine. So that resurrected the name. As far as the identity of the Palestinian people, and I want to say that, you know, often we get these very clever WhatsApps which, you know, say there is no such thing and there's no such thing. The reality is that has been home to people, some of them for centuries, for thousands of years. Some of them trace their roots back. Some of them don't trace their roots back that far. So, for instance, when I mentioned the Arab refugees, unlike the normal definition of a refugee as being somebody who's expelled from their country of residence, in the case of the Palestinian refugees, had they lived in that area for 2 years, they qualified as a Palestinian refugee. So that tells us something about the people that were there. Some of them had roots going back a long way, some didn't. But the reality is that this identity has gained a momentum, and ultimately Yasser Arafat was the one that really absorbed the fact that you had to give these people a national identity if you were going to lead them and give them leadership. So that's where the name Palestine comes from. Maybe I'll just touch on another piece of history, and that is that the Ottomans ruled this region for some 400 years. People within the Ottoman Empire didn't hold title. They had sort of tribal lands. They were allocated land by a tribal leader to farm in a particular area. However, the Ottomans came along, and I think it was in 1855, they passed a law within the Ottoman Empire that required people to register ownership of land. If you registered ownership, you got free title for that land, you became responsible for it. If you didn't register it, somebody else could register title over it, or finally, it could be registered for religious purposes. So in a community where people were really peasant farmers, suddenly to contend with the reality of you have to register ownership and things like that. And the net result of that is, yes, some people did register ownership, but vast tracts of land became registered in the names of Turkish citizens that didn't even live in that area. They were opportunists. And for instance, in the Jezreel Valley, major areas there were registered in the name of absentee landlords. Although working the land were peasant farmers. They didn't have a title deed, but that was the traditional land they'd worked. The momentum starts to build around Israel. The Jewish National Fund is created to raise funds. And Jewish people are starting to be sent back, come to settle the land, and they come back with capital and are able to buy up land from absentee landlords. So you can visualize the situation. These newly fledged Jewish communities are now establishing kibbutzes, farming communities there, but there are people on the land already, peasant farmers farming the land. So you have this incredible clash. So it's very important that we not lose sight of the humanity of the Palestinian people. Many of them, history has treated them harshly, and there's a large amount of frustration with their own leadership through the ages, with the abandonment of the Arab world to them in many instances, just leaving them in refugee camps. But also, often that's the anger that's focused towards Israel and the Jewish people.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because sometimes when we are going through discussions, one can be quite clinical about it and say, you know, these are borders and this is reality, but there are people living there, and we all know how important land is and how it's tied to identity. So it does require us to also have compassion for a lot of the Palestinians on the ground, because I think they are manipulated by their leadership, and many of them probably do not share the same views as Hamas, for example, who's in power, but they can't necessarily express that. So it is a complicated situation, but, you know, I take my hat off to Israel, because Israel is continually reaching out as far as extending humanitarian aid, allowing access into hospitals for Palestinian people to be treated should they need to. They really are trying to find some kind of middle ground. And as you said, when compromises have been put on the table, the Palestinian leaders have actually just denounced it and not even willing to consider it. So yeah, I think it is a bit of a one-sided approach at the moment. And unfortunately, what doesn't help is if we are not educated ourselves, then we get drawn into the conversation and find ourselves defending certain accusations which are not even true. And that's the point of this series of Let's Talk Israel, is we want to be able to offer Christians credible, reliable, insightful information, so that should you be in a conversation where you find you suddenly defending Israel, you actually know what the status quo really is, because too many celebrities get involved having an opinion, politicians jump in and have an opinion, and many of them, they've never even been to Israel. Often in the subject of the Palestine conflict, the people that seem to be the loudest critics of Israel, they haven't even opened a history book. They have no idea. And, you know, just the very fact that Islam itself is such a young religion and yet wants to lay claim to many of the holiest sites of the Jewish people. And maybe I can ask you to close tonight for us. Maybe you can just leave us with a potential prayer pointer that we can go home as we consider what we've heard tonight, and even, you know, throughout the series. How should we be praying for Israel?
I think the instruction to pray for the peace of Jerusalem is such a broad instruction. For me, we need to be a bit more specific in our prayers. We need to pray that the nation of Israel would follow God's word, because when the nation follows God's word, you get both righteousness and you get justice. And without either of those, you don't get a situation which really helps to progress the situation from where it is now. And it's important to pray that, we've been associated with Israel for many, many years. And one of the things that's always impressed me was the charity in people towards the Palestinians. When the first Intifada broke out, there was fury in a neighborhood called Gilo, and the fury wasn't directed at the Palestinian people. It wasn't directed at, and I'm talking about in the Jewish community, it was directed at the so-called Tanzim, or the militant wings of Fatah that had taken up residence in this area and were shooting across the valley and things like that. And these Jewish people said, these people in the valley below are our friends. This is where we cut our hair. These are the restaurants we go to. This is where we shop. So there was a tremendous amount of goodwill towards the Palestinian people. And part of that goodwill was based upon relationships. And in fact, one of the products of the Oslo Accord, sadly, and the Intifadas has been that it has successfully driven a wedge between many of those relationships. Not easy to maintain those relationships. So I believe one of our prayers should be that God will restore the ability of Jewish people and Palestinians to sit side by side, because God's word doesn't divide up the land. Ultimately, our prayer needs to be that the Palestinian people would recognize that there's something about Israel that is good for them, good for the world, and that they would see it with different eyes. You mentioned Israeli outreach and things like that, the deeds that are done. You don't have to scratch far below the surface to find that in Israel. And in fact, it's those things that have broken many of the barriers in the Middle East. With the conflict in Lebanon, the border between Lebanon and Israel, there was a place called the Friendly Fence. Why was it called the Friendly Fence? Because that's where the Lebanese could cross the border and go to Israeli hospitals to have treatment. Going there, sort of anticipating that they were going into the hands of the devil, and they would come back realizing that the care and the love that had been showered on them showed them that this Israel was not the Israel that they'd been taught about. And one of the greatest tragedies, and I mentioned it earlier on, is an educational system that poisons the mind of people towards the Jews and towards Israel. So let's pray for God's word to manifest itself amongst the nation of Israel, that they would seek to constantly be seeking justice, not just within their ranks, but for the Palestinian people as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. God bless you. As they say in Israel, shalom.
And shalom from me as well. Good night, everybody. God bless.